Welcome to this lecture on social movements. In this week's lecture, we'll start by introducing the topic of social movements, what they are, and generally how collective action transforms into a social movement. Then we'll survey some of the main sociological frameworks that attempt to explain the emergence of social movements. Finally, we'll examine the phenomenon of new social movements. Social movements essentially represent the transition of collective action into organizational forms that are focused on changing society. Generally speaking, a social movement emerges when a group of people reach a critical mass in terms of their membership and their organization. Over time, we see social movements transition from one-off events, such as demonstrations, to more enduring and routine activities. So what is it, anyways, that compels people to become part of a social movement? We could start by assuming that they feel frustrated or oppressed by the gap between what they expect to have and their current situation. This is the basis of the relative deprivation approach to social movements. The basic idea here is that your frustration or your sense of being oppressed is always relative to some other group that has what you lack. We call those other people a reference group. Two other preconditions have to be met before a social movement can emerge. First, people have to feel like they have a right to what they want, and second, that they can't obtain what they want through conventional means. Now, the relative deprivation approach doesn't always help us make sense of social movements because sometimes people can feel quite deprived without doing anything in response, and other times people are moved to act without necessarily feeling deprived. This is in part why the resource mobilization approach is helpful. Social movements need more than people feeling deprived. They also require material resources, money, organizational skills, leadership. What this amounts to is the relatively straightforward idea that social movements coalesce and gain critical mass when they are able to mobilize resources. That could be organizational and administrative, or it could be related to the ability to raise money. Both in Canada and the USA, strike activity is historically high when unemployment is low, union membership is high, and governments are being generous with social benefits. In any case, we tend not to equate groups challenging authority with themselves being institutions, but that is in fact how social change happens. On several occasions recently, thousands of documents from the ISIS terrorist group have been leaked, and what they reveal, for the most part, is an obsession not with ideology, but with mobilizing resources. Detailed spreadsheets itemizing salaries and expenses, the completed application forms for prospective ISIS fighters, and the list goes on. Now we have a better sense of how social movements mobilize resources, but how do they capture hearts and minds? In other words, how do the ideas, the values, and the brand of any given social movement find a sympathetic audience with potential recruits? For answers to these questions, we turn to the frame alignment approach, which examines whether or not the discourse or the image of a social movement is likely to find an audience. A focal point for this approach is media analysis, looking at how social movements present themselves to the public, whether we are talking about Greenpeace or ISIS. Specifically, frame alignment examines how social movements present and modify their ideas in order to line up with the beliefs and aspirations of potential group members. In the case of Greenpeace or other environmental organizations, there's a good deal of emphasis on aligning the green consciousness of its message with the sentiments that are out there in the general population. A very different example is ISIS, which has successfully attracted thousands of fighters by aligning its message of anti-Western sentiment and violent heroism with the discontentment and frustrations of potential recruits. New social movements are actually not so new, having been in evidence since at least the 1970s. Nevertheless, sociologists use the term to distinguish several unique features of social movements worldwide that differ from traditional forms of protest. For one thing, we are talking about movements that are not based solely in grievances based on social class, but which address a wide range of interests and identities, from the rights of First Nations peoples to protests about climate change. For another, new social movements attract large numbers of highly educated and reasonably well-off people. To take yet again the recurring example of ISIS and other radical Islamist movements, you would be surprised to find out how many of the recruits are well-educated and worldly. New social movements are also, more often than not, comfortable working on a global scale and are adept at using the internet and a broad variety of social media, something that we will take up in the seminar. Make sure you check out the video in this week's folder called The Success of Nonviolent Civil Resistance, which looks at the increasing global success of social movements that avoid violence. Thanks for dropping into this lecture.